Hello, my friends, and welcome to Genealogy Gems podcast episode number 307. I am Lisa Louise Cook, and I'm so glad that you're here with me today for this May 2026 episode. You know, here in the United States, Memorial Day is a solemn day. It's set aside to honor the men and women of our military who gave their lives in service to our country. For many of us as family historians, that sacrifice is written into the stories of our own ancestors. It's etched on gravestones, tucked into faded photographs, and preserved in the records that they left behind. Well, in this episode, we are devoting our time together to military genealogical research. I have gathered several of our Military Minute segments that professional forensic genealogist and military records expert Michael Strauss has recorded for the show over the years. And I'm going to weave them all together so that we can experience the full arc of what's possible with these powerful records. Whether your ancestor served in the Revolutionary War, marched in the World Wars, or wore the uniform in more recent conflicts, Michael will walk you through the kinds of files, databases, and historical clues that can open new doors in your research, while also deepening your appreciation for the price that they paid. My hope is that as you listen, you'll be inspired to seek out the stories behind the names in your tree and to remember and honor them in a fresh, meaningful way this Memorial Day. Let's begin this special Memorial Day journey into our family's military past.
Hello, listeners. You have been drafted for the first episode of Military Minute with Michael Strauss. By discussing records that relate to military service, this will help uncover hidden gems about the lives of our ancestors. One of the first records you may come across for your U.S. families are draft registrations. Now, these are civilian records, but they can provide clues to locate proof of military service. Draft records date back to the days of the Civil War, with the first national draft being signed by Abraham Lincoln in 1863. It was called the Enrollment Act, and it replaced the former Militia Act of 1862. This draft only applied to those men residing in states under Union control. On the Confederate side, there exists a limited number of records, and these will be discussed in a future episode. Now fast forward 65 years, during which time no draft existed, to the fighting during World War I. With the United States having officially declared neutrality, the Selective Service Act of 1917 was passed, answering the call to mobilize our military should the United States go to war. This draft consisted of 3 registrations, targeting all men between the ages of 17 and 45. The eve of World War II again saw the passage of another act, the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, which again mobilized men should the war in Europe come to the United States, this containing 7 registrations. Now, genealogists don't need to visit the National Archives in person to gain access to all of these original records. Many of the draft records and registrations are available on Ancestry, on Fold 3, and Family Search. Some registrations are still in the custody of the National Archives in St. Louis, Missouri, while later records for those men born after 1960, these are held by the Selective Service System. Now, whether you're a seasoned genealogist or new to the hobby, all of us have heard family lore or stories, and this tends to be difficult to prove. In my wife's family as a child, she had heard that her great-grandmother, a woman named Catherine Felker, was married to 2 men at the same time. Her first husband, Clayton Lyme, had disappeared and died during the influenza pandemic, and that the marriage to her second husband, a man named Paul Stump, wasn't legal, as no proof of a death or a divorce ever surfaced for her first husband. Catherine was raised in the Dunkard faith in a strict Lancaster County, Pennsylvania home, and this story was not widely shared outside of her family. Locating both men's World War I draft cards answered questions raised by the family, as it steered me in 2 different directions. The draft card of Clayton Lyme led me to his death certificate and his cause of death, from influenza, while the draft card of Paul Stump led me to his military service during World War I and his prior service from 1911 to 1914. Both draft cards listed the same spouse, which only served to validate the family lore that she could not have legally married both men at the same time. On a future Military Minute, we will revisit draft registrations with details about how he was classified, whether fit for military duty or with an occupation vital to the war effort. Next month, we'll muster in again as we discuss the compiled military service records essential to your soldier's life in the military. Hello, listeners. We have mustered in for another episode of Military Minutes with Michael Strauss. In our first meeting, we talked about the importance of draft registrations. If a clue found in those records listed military service, you will want next to search for his compiled military service record. Now, the records are abbreviated as CMSR and are located at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., for the Volunteer Army, and these cease at the turn of the 20th century. Now, these records don't cover regular Army enlistments. Genealogists owe a debt of gratitude to Colonel Fred C. Ainsworth. Now, he was a regular Army officer and a surgeon, and he helped to organize and index the original records that were then in the custody of the War Department. By 1894, his team of clerks had finished indexing the Mexican War, the Civil War, and the Indian Wars. Afterwards, they started to index the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and lastly, the Spanish-American War, followed by the Philippine Insurrection. The Revolutionary War required the use of other records from the Treasury, the Interior, and the State Department that were used to reconstruct information that was lost in a devastating fire in 1800 in Washington, D.C. Ainsworth didn't live long enough to see the National Archives, where the treasures that he helped to create are held. He died 2 weeks before the act to create the archives was passed by Congress in 1934. Now, these records list the name, the unit, and details of the veteran. Some records included physical descriptions. The records only represent the Army, except during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, where some naval records and prisoner of war records are also included. Enlistment records of the other military branches, the Navy, the Marines, and the Revenue Cutter Service, a forerunner of our current U.S. Coast Guard, will be discussed in a future episode. Now, many of the compiled military service records are available on Ancestry, on Fold 3, and some are found on Family Search, and they cover the Revolutionary War to the Spanish-American War. Links will be provided in the show notes for you to access these collections. Now, your ancestor may have multiple entries in the compiled military service records. This could occur if the soldier served in more than one unit, or in the case of John LeMaster, who enlisted in 2 different armies. The Civil War divided our nation, and it tested the loyalties of all persons who lived during this time. LeMaster chose the Confederacy, at least initially, when in 1861 in Charlestown, Virginia, he enlisted with the 2nd Virginia Infantry, fighting alongside his brigade commander, a man named Thomas J. Jackson, who would simply later be known as Stonewall Jackson. After the Confederate loss at the Battle of Gettysburg, he deserted and lived in Martinsburg in what was now West Virginia, where on his draft registration he was listed as a deserter from the rebel army. In 1864, he enlisted in the United States Army with the 3rd West Virginia Cavalry, serving out the duration of the war until 1865. Interestingly, after the war, he was granted a federal pension with no mention of his former service in the Confederacy. Listeners, you're dismissed until next month, when we will again muster in and talk about the 20th century equivalent record called the Official Military Personnel Files that are located in the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, Missouri.
This Memorial Day, as we pause to honor those who served and sacrificed, it's a poignant time to reflect on the personal legacies within our own family trees. Newspapers.com is the perfect companion for anyone looking to go beyond basic service records and truly rediscover the people behind the names. With access to over 1 billion pages of historical newspapers, you can uncover the lived experiences of your ancestors that typical records often miss. Imagine finding front-page stories detailing a grandfather's return from overseas, local letters to the editor written by a great-uncle during his service, candid photographs or community tributes that capture a hero's life back home. These are little treasures that turn a cold date on a timeline into a vivid, breathing story of courage and character. Don't just remember their names. Reclaim their stories. The search is easy and intuitive, allowing you to search by name, keyword, or hometown at your own pace. Visit newspapers.com/genealogygems today and enjoy 20% off a subscription. Make this Memorial Day the time that you turn your family tree into a lasting tribute. Newspapers.com/genealogygems.
Hello, listeners. We've mustered in for another episode of Military Minutes with Michael Strauss. Last, we talked about the compiled military service records. To recap, if your ancestor served in the military during the 19th century or earlier, then the records are in the custody of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The exact dates for each military branch will vary in years accordingly. For an example, Army enlisted personnel before 1912 and Marine Corps personnel before 1895 are in the custody of the archives. If your ancestor served during the 20th century or 21st century, the records are located at the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, Missouri. There are exceptions to veterans discharged from 1995 to the present. And these vary in years by branch, as they are held in the custody of other government offices. The records in St. Louis are referred to as the Official Military Personnel Files, or simply the OMPF files. The files are also called the 201 files, and they're named after the brown file folder that holds the personnel files. The records in St. Louis are not without their setbacks. On July 12, 1973, a disastrous fire ravaged the building where the OMPF files were housed. Between 16 and 18 million of these files were destroyed or damaged. Army personnel discharged between 1912 and 1960 sustained an 80% loss, 4 in every 5 files. Air Force personnel discharged between 1947 and 1964 sustained a 75% loss, 3 in every 4 files. But this only started alphabetically after the name of James E. Hubbard. The Navy, the Marines, and the Coast Guard were largely unaffected by the fire. Genealogists should be aware that the OMPF files are considered archival, open without restrictions, 62 years after the date of discharge. This is a rolling date. Discharge dates of 1955 and earlier are open to the public. In 2018, that date will change to 1956 and so on. After this date, records are considered non-archival. They're subject to restrictions. Only the veteran or his next of kin can have full access to these files. Now, patrons can access the records in St. Louis in one of 3 ways. They can make the pilgrimage to St. Louis. It's recommended, however, that you make an appointment, as the research space there is limited. You can employ an independent researcher. There's an online list of researchers available for hire. Or lastly, you can request the record by mail using what is called Standard Form 180, and this is online and available to researchers to download. Now, I didn't fully grasp how many records were lost in the fire until I ordered a record of one of my family members. My grandfather, Richard Keller, when he was a small child, received postcards from his great-uncle Zerby Howard. Now, I remember him. He died when I was 10 years old. Zerby served during World War I and was a resident of Lebanon, Pennsylvania. I have in my possession 2 postcards that were sent to my grandfather. They recorded his name, his rank, and his military unit. I ordered his file, and it took several months. And when it arrived, I expected it to be full of information. His file was completely destroyed, and only some reconstructed records were located, which was 3 pages, which recorded him on a final payment roll with other men from his unit. I've included in the show notes the copies of the pages I received from St. Louis. Now, St. Louis has other records available to researchers. The Army filed morning reports organized by unit. I also searched in Pennsylvania and found records at the local level that were not in the hands of the federal government. These records will be discussed in a future episode. Listeners, you're dismissed until next month,
when we will again muster in and go back to the days of the Revolutionary War and the subsequent years that followed after the birth of our republic, where we will discuss what it meant to be a volunteer soldier, a regular soldier, or a militiaman.
Hello, listeners. We've mustered in for another episode of Military Minutes with Michael Strauss. We finished our tour looking at both the compiled military service records and the OMPF files. No doubt words like regulars, volunteers, and militia appeared in various papers. This month we will explore the different types of enlistments. Regulars were those men who enlisted for a specific period of time as part of the standing army. These men could have enlisted during a war period or peacetime. During the colonial period, they may have been recorded with other names, as either the Continental Line or part of the Flying Camp. The latter were men who served directly under General George Washington. Now, volunteers were men who served during wartime or any period of emergency whose service was considered to be in the interest of the federal government. Recorded from the Revolutionary War onward, these men at the time might have also been listed as associators. They are not to be confused with militia. Volunteers were not subject to fines for non-service. Like the regulars, these records can be found at the National Archives. A good example of the difference between regulars and volunteers can be found during the Spanish-American War of 1898. During that war, there was a regular Army 1st U.S. Cavalry that served alongside the volunteer 1st U.S. Cavalry. The latter was known as the Rough Riders, led by Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. Lastly were the men who enlisted in the militia, organized by state and oftentimes at the county level. Militia were generally men called up for limited military duty between the ages of 17 and 60. As needed for the common defense. They were often required to serve for a period of time based on the local militia laws on the books. The men were subject to fines and penalties for non-service. Records of the militia are going to be found at your local state archives. Now, taking one war period as an example, one of my ancestors, Samuel Howard, served during the Civil War. Because of his age, he wasn't able to enlist until 1865 when he turned 18. He was a volunteer soldier who served as a substitute for another man. After his discharge, he again enlisted, this time in the regular Army, in 1866, and was assigned to the 13th U.S. Infantry, where he served 1 month before deserting at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. Now, his regular Army military service, even though brief, was completely unknown to me until just a couple of years ago. When he applied for his Civil War pension that was granted to him, he never mentioned his regular Army service. Samuel lived in Pennsylvania from the end of the Civil War until his death in 1913. He was married in 1867, as this may have had some significance to his actions. I believe the key to finding your ancestors, whether they served in the regulars, the volunteers, or militia, is to look at not only the federal records, but to search your local state records, as the latter may be the only place you'll find proof of military service. Now, listeners, you're dismissed until we'll again muster in and discuss the different military branches, when each was organized, and any predecessor agencies or organization when formed. Hello, listeners. We have mustered in for another episode of Military Minutes with Michael Strauss. We explored what it meant to be a regular, a volunteer, or a militiaman. Looking beyond the enlistments, we will talk about each of the 5 military branches, namely the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, and the Coast Guard. The largest of the branches is the United States Army, which dates back to 1775 to the beginning of the Revolutionary War. At the end of the war, the Army disbanded after the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. In 1796, it was reestablished and included the infantry, the cavalry, the artillery, and the Corps of Engineers. For those who had ancestors who trod the quarterdeck of a frigate, the United States Navy has always had a fine tradition of service. Dated from 1775 at the end of the war, like the Army, it was also disbanded, but it was reestablished under the Naval Act of 1794. The Navy can be classified into two eras. The earlier known to sailors as the Old Navy began with the age of the wooden sailing ships. The latter, known as the New Navy, witnessed further innovations in the late 19th century as the United States transformed into a global power. Now, officially the youngest of the military branches, the Air Force was formed as part of the Security Act of 1947. Air Force history, however, dates earlier when it was part of the United States Army since 1907. Over the next 40 years of service, they would grow and change until their separation from the Army. Each of these changes will be listed in the show notes. Now, the beginnings of the United States Marines date from 1775. Their mission included ship-to-ship fighting, onboard security, and landing force operations, working alongside their Navy cousins. At the end of the war, the Marines, like the Navy, disbanded. The Navy Act of 1794 reestablished the Marines that would become known as an elite fighting force the world over. Now, the smallest of the military branches dates from 1790 with the formation of the Revenue Cutter Service. In 1915, President Woodrow Wilson would sign into law the Act to create the Coast Guard, when both the Revenue Cutter Service and the Life-Saving Service would merge together. In 1939, the United States Lighthouse Service was added. Although first envisioned as a force of revenue tax collectors, their ability to conduct many diverse missions during both peacetime and war really became the hallmark of this service. Now, genealogists who look deeper in their family tree can often find gems that are sometimes overlooked. Over the last 30 years of researching, I have found a number of my ancestors who had served from the colonial period onward, all of whom had served in the Army. Now, several years ago, I was given a box of photographs from a relative of mine on my dad's side. One of those images was marked Russell Strauss, and it was in the uniform of the Navy during World War II. Now, he was my grandfather's first cousin, and I didn't really know him very well growing up. Between doing research and interviewing my relatives, I was able to piece together clues to questions I had about his military service. It was his picture in uniform that led me to put together that final clue about his service career. On a future episode, we will discuss how looking at images only, with nothing else, can provide information about your military ancestor. In our previous episodes, I've mainly focused on men who had served. Next, we will talk about the women who had served in the military and the records they left behind.
This episode is brought to you by Archives.com, the trusted destination for anyone ready to bring their family stories to life. With access to millions of historical records, from birth and marriage certificates to census data, military records, and more, Archives.com gives you the tools to dive deep into your genealogy and uncover the rich, vibrant details that make your family history truly come alive. Their easy-to-use platform welcomes both beginners and seasoned researchers, guiding you smoothly through vast collections of documents. Behind the simple search interface, powerful technology works tirelessly to deliver accurate, meaningful results that help you connect the dots and reveal stories waiting to be told for generations. Whether you're eager to find long-lost relatives, confirm cherished family tales, or trace your roots back many decades, Archives.com offers an affordable and enjoyable way to add depth and color to your family's narrative. Don't let your history remain a mystery. Visit Archives.com today and start breathing new life into your family's past. Your story is just a few clicks away. Visit Archives.com.
Hello, listeners. We've mustered in for another episode of Military Minutes with Michael Strauss. Last, we explored the different military branches. It was men who primarily bore arms in times of emergency. However, not all women filled the traditional roles relegated to them by society. We focus on the many contributions of those women who served in the ranks of the military. Now, from the days of the Revolutionary War, any woman who chose to fight would have had to have disguised herself as a man. This was the case of Deborah Sampson, who served under the alias of Robert Shirtliff until she was discovered and discharged. Other women, like Margaret Corbin, were camp followers and served by cleaning and cooking. During the Battle of Fort Washington in New York, her husband John was mortally wounded, manning his artillery piece. Margaret took his place on the gun, continuing the fight against the British. For both women, their sacrifice was not forgotten. Each was awarded pensions from the government based on their service, although Corbin received 1/2 of the pension allowance because she was a woman. Later, during the Civil War, women again sought to join the ranks of the military. Take, for example, Jenny Irene Hodgers. She was a native of Ireland, enlisting in Company G of the 95th Illinois, where she served using the alias of Albert Cashier. Her identity was kept secret during the war. It wasn't until 1911 when a doctor discovered her actual identity. The turn of the 20th century had women more accepted in the ranks of the Army. The establishment of the Nursing Corps in 1901 saw the first large-scale enlistments of women. Still later in World War II, with the forming of the Women's Auxiliary Corps, called the WACs, and in the air, with the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, known as the WASPs. The other military branches took nearly as long to accept women in their ranks. The Navy in 1908 established the Nursing Corps with their first enlistments. In 1918, Opa Johnson became one of the first women to put on the uniform of the United States Marine. Twin sisters Genevieve and Lucille Baker were the first women to join the Coast Guard in 1917. Like the Army's organizations, in 1942, the Naval Women's Reserve, known as the Waves, was followed shortly by the Coast Guard Women's Reserve, which was known as the Spars. Many of these women were relegated to nursing and clerical positions, with very little opportunity for combat experience. It wasn't until World War II that larger numbers of women were sent into combat. In 1948, President Truman signed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act that allowed for the permanent presence of women in all the military branches, a tradition that holds strong. Today, the descendants of these early pioneers can look back to learn from their past experiences, striving for continued service to the United States for future generations. Last month, I shared a story about Russell Strauss, who served in the Navy during World War II. Now, one of his two sisters also served. His younger sibling, Catherine, served in the Army. She was trained as a nurse before the war. Catherine joined the Army in 1943, serving in the Nursing Corps, being commissioned a first lieutenant. She was sent overseas 34 times, stationed on board a hospital ship, where she cared for the sick and wounded that were removed from the combat zones in France and Italy. With the end of the war in 1945, she was discharged and resumed her nursing career until her death in 1972. Now, researching the women in our families during wartime can offer the chance to find gems that might otherwise go unnoticed. Now, listeners, you're dismissed until we will again muster in and discuss photographs of our military ancestors and where to find them, often when all we have is an image of them in uniform and nothing more.
Military Minutes contributor Michael Strauss recently sent us a great podcast segment about finding and identifying photographs of our military ancestors. I'm going to play this segment for you, but there's more to this story that I'll share with you afterward.
Battalion, attention, right, dress, front, right shoulder, arms, forward, march.
Hello, listeners. We've mustered in for another episode of Military Minutes with Michael Strauss. Last, we explored the numerous contributions of women who served. Now, we touch on photographic ephemera and the stories of our military ancestors. Collecting and identifying images can sometimes present a challenge, not only knowing where to find potential images, but properly identifying the uniforms located through family or at a research archive. Now, our national government offers genealogists access to tens of thousands of images, both online and indexed. Two facilities include the National Archives and the Library of Congress, both located in Washington, D.C. Both will be discussed in the show notes. Another excellent source of military images outside of Washington is found at the United States Army Heritage and Education Center, located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, with an online search catalog of military images spanning multiple wars, One example comes from the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, otherwise known as MULLIS. It was organized in 1865 of officers of the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps during the Civil War. Many other state and local resources outside of these should also be considered to find photographs. Now, after having exhausted some of the research facilities I've mentioned, consider looking into some unexpected places. I regularly search on eBay looking for military images to purchase. Several months ago, I found a photograph of an unidentified man pictured in his military uniform. It was a cabinet card, measuring 6.5 inches by 4.25 inches on hard cardboard stock. The image was in excellent condition, and it dated circa 1895 to 1900. The only clue that I had to any possible identification was the photographer's name on the front that indicated that it was taken at the Fender Brothers studio in Lima, Ohio. Searching newspapers, city directories, confirmed the studio was in operation in 1898 and owned by two brothers, Charles and William Fenner. The image was of a young man with the rank of first sergeant, based on the chevrons on both of his sleeves. His kepi, or hat, had a brass insignia with cross rifles with the number 2 above and the letter C below. I first thought this soldier was from the regular United States Army. I hadn't considered the National Guard. The Guard recruited in multiple locations inside of Ohio. The 2 represented the regiment number, and the C indicated his company. Looking further at the history of this unit, Company C of the 2nd Ohio National Guard served during the Spanish-American War and was initially organized in 1875 and recruited men from Lima, Ohio, where the image was taken. According to the muster rolls in 1898, the first sergeant was a man named Albert E. Gale. My search now had a name connected to the image. Gale served with the National Guard from 1891 to 1918. Several of the local newspaper articles included pictures of Gale, and they looked like the younger image of him from 1898. Now, listeners, you're dismissed. Until next time.
I loved hearing about that process from Michael, but I was curious about some of the connections that he made, so I asked him for more step-by-step details, and he sent back some very detailed explanations that I think could really help your own research. And a surprise, too. And he was wrong about one thing, but here's how he figured it out. He wrote, "This research actually didn't end with that segment that I sent you. I had some unexpected turns afterwards. So let me tell you what happened from the start. I found the photograph on eBay for sale and bought it on September 28th, 2017. When I got the image, it was unidentified with no name listed on the photograph. I started by trying to date the image to a range of years. I knew the image was a cabinet card and dated sometime between 1890 and 1905, roughly, when these images were very popular. I had the name of persons who took the picture listed at the bottom of the image. It stated Fenner Brothers, located at 202.5 North Main Street in Lima, Ohio. I found the photographers, William J. and Charles H. Fenner, in business through city directories at the same address from 1896 to 1903. Additionally, I located proof of the business in some ads taken out in the Lima newspapers from 1898 to 1900. Lastly, for location, I looked at a couple of the D.A. Sanborn maps for Lima, Ohio, and I found additions in 1893 and 1899 that both showed the address, and listed on the second floor was a photograph gallery. That clearly had to be the half that was recorded in the city directories. I knew from looking at the image, the uniform, that it was a soldier who likely served during the Spanish-American War of 1898, and based on the previously found information to date the image, it looked good for a match. Now that I had dated the image to a short range of time, I sought to try to identify the individual based on the uniform appearance. I first thought it could be United States Army regulars, but this didn't seem to be the case when I got a close-up scanned look at the buttons on the uniform. Even up close and fuzzy, they were not crossed rifles as they should have been. I knew this was to be the case because I have a copy of the U.S. Army Uniform and Equipment Regulations of 1889, which you can search in Google Books or you can purchase at Amazon, and I've put links in the show notes to that for you. Now, these were in effect from 1889 to 1902 when the Army adapted new changes in the uniforms. The book specifically spelled out the uniform specifications and what the equipment looked like. The ornament button on the front of the uniform should have been crossed rifles, and it wasn't. I knew that National Guard units from each state that were federalized would have the same uniforms from the regular Army, but would have maintained their unique statehood identified through the buttons and from the unit information found on the cap. Also, looking at the uniform specs, I was able to determine that the rank of the soldier was a first sergeant. Now, this is a unique company level rank that typically has only one person in that position. On the hat, which is a forage cap, that was the crossed rifles and the number and letter designations for the company and regiment numbers. These are all brass and identify the exact unit, again, from the 1889 manual. I then knew for certain that I was looking at a local state regiment. Based on the photograph, I knew it was Company C of the 2nd Regiment. Now, which state? I knew the photograph being taken in Lima, Ohio, would be powerful evidence that this was an Ohio National Guard unit. I then found the annual report of Ohio in 1891 that stated that National Guard uniform buttons would take the shape of the Great Seal of the state. Now, I've sent you an image showing the original button close up side by side with what the buttons looked like. I realize the original image is fuzzy, but it's clear that they are the same design. And you can see those in the show notes. The final part of the identification for the regiment came in the form of the adjunct general office roster of soldiers from that unit in 1898 at the time of the war. Company C of the 2nd Ohio National Guard Regiment was recruited in Lima, Ohio. That provided the final proof to me that I had the correct unit. So going down the roster of names, there was one first sergeant in the entire company, a man by the name of Albert E. Gale. Now, I thought this was where it would end. I mentioned about an unexpected twist in the story. I found a photograph from the newspaper for Gale years later in the 1920s, and I tried to compare the two. The image at best in the newspaper was lousy, but they did share some common features. I thought I had my man. Just recently, I got an email reply back from the Allen County Museum and Library in Lima, Ohio, that they had a really nice, clear image of Gale during World War I and would be sending me the copy that I requested, but not received earlier. When I got the image and I compared the two men, I looked closer and thought these men really don't appear to be the same. I asked my wife for a second opinion, and she agreed. This really got me upset that I could have pegged the wrong person and all the while know that I had the correct military regiment and company. I went back to the original roster of men and I read every line of men of the other ranks, and there found a small notation for a man named John E. Porter, who mustered in as the first sergeant for the company and then was demoted to sergeant when Albert E. Gale was promoted to take his place. I sought to confirm his new name to see if this was the actual identity of the image. I again asked the Allen County Museum and Library for help, and they had two images of Porter, one from later in life and another of him in uniform with a group of persons, including his parents. He is the second from the left in the photograph. And of course, folks, those of you listening, you got to go check this out in the show notes for this episode 161. Michael says, I looked at the images and I couldn't deny the fact that the image wasn't Gale, but was actually Porter. What a huge surprise to me. I pegged the exact unit and the rank, but I never expected the twist that followed. I'm also attaching copies of the images for you to see, and you will agree that it's the same persons. I'm embarrassed that I hadn't gotten everything in my research plan exactly right to start, But in the end, I did solve the question. And this goes to make a point that we are only human and we can make mistakes. But following through all the way to the end eventually led me to the real truth. I love this story, and check out the show notes for all of the images that Michael referred to. And it's a great reminder, just when we get all excited and do our happy dance that we think we've nailed it, if you have that little glimmer, that little something that goes, oh, that's, I don't know, that's a little off, but I really want this to fit. How much more exciting was it that he actually pushed through, that he actually kind of questioned himself, challenged himself, and didn't just kind of fall back on his laurels, but pushed further, and then got to the real story, which is actually a little more intriguing than just finding the original person to begin with. So I love this. I find it a huge motivation, and I hope you do too. And of course, thanks to Michael Strauss, our Military Minutes man, for sharing his research adventure. Today's episode is sponsored by MyHeritage, a global discovery platform enjoyed by 110 million people worldwide. MyHeritage has it all and offers a full-service experience that bridges your past, present, and future. The MyHeritage DNA kit reveals your ethnic origins, and it finds your new relatives based on shared DNA. It's popular all over the world, and their constantly growing DNA database means that more matches to new relatives are just around the corner. You're going to receive a percentage breakdown of your ethnic origins for 42 supported regions and weekly email updates as new DNA matches are found. It's also the leading DNA service for anyone with European origins. So make the most of your DNA results with a MyHeritage subscription and access advanced tools for genetic genealogy, like the theory of family relativity, autoclusters, shared ancestral places, and a lot more. Order your kit today at myheritage.com/DNA.
Battalion, attention. Right, dress, front. Right shoulder, arms, forward, march.
Hello, listeners. We've mustered in for another episode of Military Minutes with Michael Strauss. Last, we explored ways to obtain photographs of our military ancestors and how to identify the unit when only an image is available. We will continue with military ephemera and the importance of diaries, letters, journals, or even postcards. Similar to photographs, there are many research facilities that have ephemera. One location I mentioned last month was the Library of Congress. Once you've searched their photographic collections, next visit the manuscript research room for diaries, letters, and journals. In their collection are more than 50,000 manuscripts, covering a broad range of topics. Instead of searching for a specific name, try looking for the military unit for a possible match. I also mentioned previously the United States Army Heritage and Education Center, located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This facility also has a nice collection of manuscripts, letters, and journals covering multiple war periods. Online searches can also be made on Archive Grid, HathiTrust, and WorldCat to find material that is available at both genealogy and historical societies. More about this in the show notes. I'm very fortunate to have a copy of a diary of one of my ancestors who fought in the Civil War. The diary comes from the collection of the Lebanon County Historical Society in Pennsylvania. My third great-grandfather, John Henry Waltz, served in Company A of the 93rd Pennsylvania Infantry. He enlisted in 1861 and mustered out at the expiration of his 3-year term of service in 1864. His diary only covers 1863. He recorded the weather every day. On May 3rd, he wrote, "Day very warm. Last night we were marched to the rear of Fredericksburg. We came up and engaged the enemy. Hottest fire ever, in which Lieutenant Brewer fell dead. Helped take him out. Left him and joined the regiment." By looking at the compiled military service records for both men at the National Archives, I was able to solidify that each man served together in the same company. Ancestry was able to confirm that Lieutenant Washington Brewer was killed in action on May 3, 1863, by looking at the burial records, the muster rolls of the unit, and the regimental history written on the 93rd Pennsylvania Regiment, published in 1911 by one of the survivors who served in the regiment years after the end of the war. Now, several months later in his diary on September 9th, Waltz also wrote, "After dinner, went to have our ambrotypes taken. I had 2 good ones taken. Day fine." This original photograph mentioned in his diary is now a part of the collection of the United States Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Now, listeners, you're dismissed until we will again muster in and revisit a topic discussed in the very first episode of Military Minutes. I talked about the importance of using draft registration cards and looking for our ancestors. Next month, we discuss in detail how your ancestors were classified in the draft. Was he fit for duty? Was military service deferred? What do the numbers on the draft cards mean? Until next time. Hello, listeners. We've mustered in for another episode of Military Minutes with Michael Strauss. The last time we met, we discussed military ephemera and the importance of diaries, letters, and journals. We revisit draft registrations from both World War I and World War II. You will recall that this was the subject of our first topic together. Since then, several listeners have had questions and comments regarding the numbering system on the cards, draft classifications, and really just how to dig deeper into the records of the Selective Service system. Now, starting with World War I draft registrations, this would include all eligible men between the ages of 18 and 45. It was separated into 3 registrations along with a supplemental one. Now, on the corners of each registration card were stamped or written a series of numbers. On the left was a serial number that was assigned to the men as soon as they registered. This could have also have been the registrant that was in line that day when the cards were filled out. Once done at the local boards, the headquarters office in Washington, D.C. would place each of the serial numbers into a container. Now, on July 20th of 1917, Secretary of War Newton Baker drew the first of 10,500 numbers from a bowl for the first registration. The first number drawn was number 258, for which every person who had that number was given an order number of 1. This was repeated until each serial number had a corresponding order number, the order number being on the upper right side of the card. On the back of the registration cards was stamped another series of numbers, followed by a letter designation. For an example, on the back of my great-grandfather Ellis Keller's card from Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, is stamped 37-5-18. Then there's a space and a capital A. The first number represented the state, 37 for Pennsylvania. The second number, 5, was the district board number, and the last number, 18, was the local board number. The letter could be A, B, or C, and this corresponded to either the first, second, or third draft registrations. Now, you should next contact the National Archives branch in Monroe, Georgia, which is near Atlanta, where the original cards are held. Once your ancestor registered, they needed to be classified and assigned a draft status. This would include classification lists and docket books of those persons registered. In addition, in Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland, and other regional branches, they hold records of physicals, questionnaires, lists of men who were examined, deserters, delinquents. These men might be referred to also as slackers, those that didn't register at all, even though they were ordered by law. And of course, men who reported for duty, and maybe men who appealed to the president to have their draft status changed. All of these are located in Record Group 163. Now, for the period of World War II, the draft process was greatly expanded, with far more registrants, and the cataloging of those cards was placed into 7 separate classification groups for all males between 18 and 65. Like the previous draft, the upper left-hand corner included the serial number, with the order number on the upper right side being completed with the same process. On October 29th of 1940, Secretary of War Henry Stimson drew numbers from a bowl representing the first
registration for those men between 21 and 36 years of age. The first number drawn for World War II was number 158, with hundreds of men across the United States who were again given order number 1. Now, to aid genealogists to help them figure out which of those 7 registration cards their ancestor filled out, there were letters that were placed in front of the serial numbers of 5 of the 7 registrations. The second registration had preceded with it the letter S. The third was preceded by a T. The fourth, or old man's draft, was preceded by the letter U. The fifth preceded by an N. And lastly, the sixth had preceded with it the letter W. Only the first and the seventh were not lettered. On the back of the card is stamped the local board, the number, and location where the registrant went to fill out the forms. Cataloged nearly the same way as they were in the previous war with the state, the district number, and the local board, the National Archives in College Park, Maryland has a master list of all the draft registration board numbers and locations alphabetically by state and territory. For World War II, you should also contact the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri, to obtain copies of the draft classification list for this war and the dockets to determine the status of your ancestor. Once this is done, then contact the Archives in College Park, Maryland, and obtain the other Selective Service records that I've mentioned for World War I. They're very much the same. All of these records are located in a different record group, Record Group 147. See the show notes for complete details and examples for each of these drafts and the documents associated with each. Join me next month when we will break down a wonderful underused source of civilian registration cards during World War I. These cards targeted women during the war and were part of the Women's Committee of the Council for National Defense that recorded the history of women on the home front from 1917 and 1918.
Hello, listeners. We've mustered in for another Military Minutes with Michael Strauss. Last, we dug deeper into the records of the Selective Service System and the numbering on the draft registration cards. Now our discussion is on an underused genealogy treasure of women's registration cards on the home front from 1917 and 1918 during World War I. Now, the Council of National Defense, which created these cards, was formed by an act of Congress as part of the Army Appropriation Act in August 1916. Now, their leadership consisted of the Secretaries of War, Navy, Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, and the Labor Departments, along with an advisory commission that was later appointed by President Wilson in October 1916. Now, their purpose was to come together and coordinate the industries and resources of the United States for national security and for our country to be prepared for war, which we believed was inevitable. Now, later in April 1917, a few short weeks after the United States entered World War I, the Women's Committee of the Council for National Defense, under the National Council, was created with suffragette Anna Howard Shaw appointed their chairman. They were organized into separate divisions and chapters in every state and included African American groups. After being formed, these volunteer women were required to fill out registration cards all across the United States asking for personal information, their background education, their employment history, and their work skills that would be valuable to the war effort. These cards not only offer genealogy details, but they give a unique look into the social history of women during the early 20th century as women move yet one step closer to national suffrage. You can see one of the examples in the show notes of one of the registration cards. Now, several collections from different states are available online to research. One of the largest online databases comes from the Grand Rapids Public Library in Michigan. Their database consists of 22,000 plus individual registration cards that are all searchable by name, address, age, and occupation. These records cover the Michigan Division of Grand Rapids for the Women's Committee for the Council of National Defense. Other states have partial collections, including Arkansas, Iowa, and Indiana that can be searched online. Now, if the geographic area of the United States you're interested in isn't online, consider looking at state archives, state libraries, museums, and other historical societies and websites by searching in card catalogs using finding aids as the best way to locate these potential collections, as most of them have never been turned over to the national government. Besides the registration cards, the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, Archives 2 I'm referring to, as part of Record Group 62, which is the Council for National Defense, has general correspondence, weekly reports of statewide division activities and the minutes for their meetings. The minutes are digitized on the National Archives website.
What a powerful journey we've taken today through the world of military records with our friend and expert, Michael Strauss. From those first draft registrations and compiled service records to understanding enlistment types, branches of service, and the often overlooked experiences of women, both in uniform and on the home front. We've also talked about taking your own research adventures into new record sets, photos, and ephemera. You know, if today's episode has inspired you to dig deeper, I would love to have you keep that momentum going. Be sure to sign up for my free Genealogy Gems email newsletter. That is the best way to stay in touch with everything going on over at Genealogy Gems, both the audio podcast, the videos, and our online courses. And the best part about signing up for the newsletter is that you get a free ebook from me in your first email. And if you're ready to take the next step and really invest in your genealogy skills, I hope you'll consider becoming a Genealogy Gems Premium member. Members get access to the full archive of all of the premium podcast episodes, our on-demand video classes, and downloadable cheat sheets for all the content that we do. It's really a good investment in you as a genealogist. You can learn more over at genealogygems.com. So until next time, thank you so much for listening, my friend. I'll talk to you soon.